Yevamos Daf Beis begins to analyze our Mishnah, starting with the beginning and trying to understand how the flow of the Mishnah works. The Gemara also gets into a discussion of where Chazal created an Isser and applied Makas Mardus, that's rabbinical Makas Malkus, to someone who did a type of Kedushin that they did not approve of. Gemara also tries to understand what is Maimer, what is the Maimer procedure, how does it work, what do you do? Is the Maimer meant to work together with a Zika, or is it meant to work independently of a Zika? I think Gemara will have a number of questions as to how Maimer is meant to be understood. So let's begin. So Gemara is noticing that in the Mishnah we begin with a machlokes between Rav Gamliel and the Chacham, and what happens when you have two different Yevamos falling to one Yavam, and you do a get to both or Maimer to both. And then the Mishnah starts with an example, and it talks about if you do Maimer and then get, or get and then Maimer. So the Gemara asks, how does this flesh out? How does this explain that machlokes? First you start talking about get following get, then you talk about Maimer following Maimer. You say that's the machlokes. And then you start with an example and you talk about get following Maimer and Maimer following the get. How does that fit? So the Gemara says it's not meant to fit. This is a separate thing. The explanation of get following get and Maimer following Maimer, which is a machlokes between Rav Gamliel and the Chachamim, like we said, that there's a brisa that explains, which you saw at the end of the last daf. The Mishnah then moves on to a different discussion, and that's a discussion of what happens when you have one Yevama and you do a get Maimer or Maimer and get. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the next phrase in the Mishnah, or the next one that it wants to discuss, and that's where the Mishnah says that if you do Maimer and then Yibum, you do Maimer, which is Kedushin to a Yevama, and then the Bia, which is Yibum. So that's Kimitzvasa. That's the correct way to do it. So the Gemara says this implies that the way you're supposed to do Bia is by first doing Kedushin. The way you're supposed to actually perform the Yibum is you do a Kedushin and then the Bia, which follows the Yibum. So the Gemara says that's Rav Huna's opinion. Rav Huna is the one who said you're supposed to do Kedushin before you do the Bia of Yibum. Everybody else says you're supposed to just do the Yibum straight away without Kedushin. So does this mean that this brisa, that this Mishnah is a proof to Rav Huna? So Rav says no, not necessarily. When it says Hareizu Mitzvasa, it just means to say this is also a fulfillment of the mitzvah. It doesn't mean to say this is the correct way to do the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, so that's pashut. Why would the Mishnah need to tell me that that's kimitzvasa? If you're not telling me that this is the main way to do it, just tell me that this also does it. Of course, it fulfills the mitzvah. I know just if you did a maimer and then a bia of yibum, it works. What's the chiddush there? The Gemara says the chiddush is you may think that this doesn't work because when somebody does maimer, which is kedushin, he's not doing the proper zika activity. The Zikas Yibum is supposed to end with a Bia. If somebody does Maimer, you may think that actually destroys the Zikas Yibum and makes it a different type of relationship, one of Kedushin. And therefore he does not do the mitzvah of Yibum, even if he goes ahead and he does the Bia afterwards. By doing Maimer, he messed up the entire Yibum. You might think that. It comes to tell me that that's not true. You can still get the mitzvah of Yibum by doing the Bia after the Maimer. Okay, now the Gemara discusses this opinion of Rav Huna that we've seen. So the Gemara quotes Rav Huna. Rav Huna says the mitzvah of Yibum is supposed to first do Kedushin and then Bia. And if you did Bia and afterwards Maimer, it works. So the Gemara says if you did Bia and afterwards Maimer, it works, of course. Once you did the Bia, that's real Yibum right there. What else is there to do? So the Gemara says, no, what it means to say is that Rav Huna says that if you did Bia without doing Kedushin, that's also good. That's also okay. Even though you're really supposed to do Kedushin first, you're supposed to do the Maimer first. It's okay if you didn't, and it still works. It's still Chal the Yibum. Gemara says, is that true? But the problem with doing Yibum via Bia without Kedushin first is that it's a pritus. The first relationship between this man and this woman is going to be the Bia. There's no Kedushin first. They're not supposed to do that. We have a statement from a brisa that says that somebody will go ahead and do that. He gets makas. Getting makas usually means that he violated an Isser D'Oraisa. If you violate an Isser D'Oraisa, it shouldn't be chal. So according to Rav Huna, who says that you're supposed to do Kedushin first, if you violate an Isser D'Oraisa, you get makas. If you don't, it shouldn't be chal at all if you didn't do Kedushin first. Someone says, no, that makas that you get is not makas D'Oraisa, it's makas mardus. It's the Rabbanan said not to do it. You're violating the Rabbanan's order. You're trying to prevent the pritus of having the first relationship between this man and woman be the Bia. And to prevent their princess, they said that if you don't listen to them and you don't do Kiddushin first, you're going to get Makas Mardus, which is imposed by the Rabbanan. It's not Malchus Dairaisa, and therefore there's no reason that this Yibum shouldn't work. So I think we're bringing examples of a number of different types of Malchus to Rabbanan that were given by the Chachamim to prevent Prita. So the Gemara says that Rav gave Malchus to anyone who was Mekadesh B'bir. There are three ways. This is not talking about Yavam and Yavam. This is talking about any random couple. That there are three ways to effect that Kiddushin. One of them is that they just go ahead and they do a beer without any Kiddushin or anything beforehand. The Gemara says that although that works direct, so Rav gave Malchus to somebody who did that because it's a pritus. Somebody who's Mekadesh out on the street, he just meets a lady in the street and he gives a Kiddushin. That's also a pritus, and Rav gave a Malchus for that. Somebody who's Mekadesh without Shidduchin, without any type of arrangement, without any research, without any meeting, without deciding to get engaged beforehand and then following through. He's Mekadesh, somebody just goes straight ahead and is Mekadesh without that preamble. Rav gave Malchus to that also. Another example is someone who's Mevatel a get, somebody who gives a get and then cancels it. Somebody who makes known that a get that he gives was forced and therefore it's no good. He's being moiser maidah on a get. Somebody who argues with a shlichut rabbanan, he's chutzpahdik to him, he violates his authority. That is also someone who got Malchus from Rav. Somebody who had a chayrum from the rabbanan for 30 days and did not do anything to resolve it, he got Malchus from Rav as well. And also somebody who lived in the house of his mother-in-law, he gets Malchus as well. So someone who lived in the house of his mother-in-law, that means that if somebody just passed by the house of his mother-in-law, he does not get Malchus. We had an incident that happened where somebody passed by the gate, the doorway of his mother-in-law's house, and Rav Sheshes gave him Malchus. That was a different case. That was a specific incident where that mother-in-law suspected him of improper behavior, and therefore they went ahead and imposed Malchus just for walking in the area. There was a restraining order over there that he should avoid the area. Okay, now in the Nahardah they said over all these lists differently. They said the only thing the Rav gave Malchus for was someone who's Mekadesh with Bia and without any prior arrangement, with Bia without Shidduchi. And there's a different version of that it says even with Shidduchi, someone who's Mekadesh B'Bia, that is a priestess anyway. Okay, now the Gemara goes into a brisa discussing how Maimer is meant to be performed. How do you do the Kiddushin of Yibum? How do you do Maimer? So the Gemara says, just like regular Kiddushin, you could give kesef, you could give money, or you could give something worth money, give it to the woman. That's Kiddushin. You could also do shtar. You could give her a contract of Kiddushin. So the Gemara says, how do you do contract of Kiddushin? The Gemara says, what's the question? Same way Mekadesh B'Kesef for a regular woman, same procedure works for Kiddushin of Maimer. So Mekadesh B'Shtar with a regular woman works for Maimer as well. Mekadesh B'Shtar for a regular woman means you give her something that's not worth anything. All it is a piece of paper or cheres, what's written on it that says, I Mekadesh you with this contract. So you could have the same thing here. He gives her the contract. It's not worth anything. He says, I'm Mekadesh you with this. So why is there a question? So the Gemara says the question was not about shtar kiddushin. The question was about the ksuba. How is the ksuba written for a yevama? How does that work exactly? Now, ksuba was a contract that's signed by a husband when he marries a woman, which gives him responsibility to support her and to take care of her, and it gives her a financial security payment if he divorces her or if he dies. The main purpose of that is to give her security, because otherwise, if he didn't have that obligation, then he could just let her go at any time. She wouldn't feel secure in the marriage. She wouldn't fully commit to it. In order to make sure that she will, we have that contract that he has to sign to take care of her during the marriage and after the marriage as well. He has to pay support. So Gemara says, how does that work for Yavam? So the Gemara says the Shak Suba works in a similar way, except that he writes that you're going to be supported by me. While we're married, I'm going to support you. But if we get divorced, you're going to take your penalty from the estate of your original first husband. And that's because Chazal viewed that he did not choose to marry this woman. Shemayim placed her on his responsibility, and therefore he doesn't have to have the responsibility to support her afterwards. However, if there is not enough money in the estate, the Ksuba specifies that he does have to pay, and that's because she needs to have security in order to commit herself to this marriage altogether, and that it shouldn't be easy for him to just send her away. Now the Gemara has some questions. So the Gemara says, Abaye asks Rabba, what happens if somebody gives a get? This is without Maimer. This is woman is falling to Yibam, and he gives a get, but the type of get that he gives is one that would not work for a regular divorce. If you have a regular man married to a regular woman, he gives her a puzzle get, it wouldn't work. Does that work to create the get of the partial breaking of Zika that a get between a Yavam and a Yavama creates? Now that creation really has no place deraisa. That get that's given by a Yavam to a Yavama was created in order to prevent mistakes, and the Chachamim give it power. The question is, if it's a puzzle get, does that work? So the example that Abaye brings up is if somebody gives a get that says you're divorced from me, but you're not permitted to anyone else. So in a real get, that doesn't work because the point of a get is to divorce her from him and permit her to everyone else. If it does not break all the bonds, but she's still tied to him, it doesn't work as a get. The question is, what if you have a Yavam writes a get like that? What's the two sides of the argument? On the one hand, we only created the concept of get, similar to the concept of get between a regular man and a woman. So since this type of get wouldn't work in a regular marriage, it shouldn't work in a Yavam relationship either. On the other hand, the point of the recognizing the get was that people will confuse it with a chalitza. So do we say that this type of get looks like a real get as far as people can tell, and they'll also confuse it with a regular get and therefore with a chalitza? So the Gemara says, yes, we'll confuse it with a regular thing, and therefore it does create a partial isser between the two of them. It starts the chalitza process and does create a thing. So the Gemara says, well, how far are you going to take that? What if he gives her a blank piece of paper? You're going to say, well, it looks like a get, and therefore it creates a partial separation, creates an isser between them? The Gemara says, no, it has to be something that has some halachic implication. A blank piece of paper does nothing. But if he gives a get that says you're divorced from me and not permitted to anyone else, that does have a halachic implication in a regular marriage, and that's if the guy is a Kohen, she becomes forbidden to him, she becomes considered to be divorced from him. It's what we call a reach haget. It has the scent of a get to it. And that is learned out of a pasuk specifically that says Ve'isha gusha me'isha, a woman who's divorced from her husband is forbidden to a Kohen. That's even if she's only divorced from her husband, but she's not permitted to anyone else, that still asks her on her husband if he's a Kohen. So therefore there is some halachic validity to that, and therefore we count it in this case as well. Okay, now there's another question that Rami Bar Chama asks. If somebody says to a sofer, so he first has an introduction. If somebody says to a sofer, write a get for my arusa. That is, he has a woman that he is nisaris to. He's engaged to. He has kedushin, but not nisuin. He says, write a get. And after, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to do nisuin. I'm going to marry her. And then I'm going to use your get that you wrote while she was still in arusa. So in a case like that, the halacha is the get's a good get. However, if he would write a get for a random woman who he's not married to, take that written get, put it away, then marry her, and then divorce her with that get, that wouldn't work. I mean, we see from there that the halacha is that a get has to be written for someone, to a woman that he could divorce. He has some relationship. He's at least in a rusa to her. Someone who's random in the street he's no relationship to, and you write a get, at that time, the get's possible, even if he later marries her. Can't use that. Which says, what happens if somebody writes a get for his Yevama? There is a connection between them, there's a zika between them. Can he use that get after he does yibum, or is that not considered to be a strong enough connection or not? So the Gemara says, take you, that question stands, we don't have an answer to that. Now Rav Chananya has a question. His question is, if somebody writes a get and he says, this is a get that's meant to break a zika and not a mimer. Or if it says, this is going to break a mimer and not a zika. What happens to that? Does that work or not? What's the two sides of the argument? So the question is, how does mimer work? A mimer creates a connection. Does that work together with the zika? The mimer is a partial connection. The zika is a partial connection. The two of them together work to create a relationship. Or is two independent channels? Zika is one relationship. Mimer is a different relationship. They're two separate things from each other. Why is that important? Because if he writes a get, if they are considered to be working together, and he writes a get for one and not the other, then he wrote a get for half a relationship. You can't do that. That's useless. You can't say you divorce half a woman. Then it wouldn't work. If on the other hand, they're two different relationships, and you could divorce one of those relationships and not the other. So what's the halach over here? So the Gemara doesn't have an answer, but the Gemara says you should be able to learn out of something that Rava said. Rava said that somebody could have a situation where a balas maimer falls to yibum with its tzara, And if somebody writes a get to the mimer, it takes that relationship off, and then that tzara is considered to be free. So you see that Rava holds that you can take off a mimer even though you don't take off a zika. So when it says, okay, Rava knew the answer to that. Rava was clear on that. Halacha Rav Chananya considered to be a question, and that question stands. He doesn't have an answer to that. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the next phrase in the Mishnah where it says if somebody does chalitza and then he does mimer, so that mimer has no effect. After chalitza, nothing takes any effect at all. So Gemara says this is Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Rabbi Akiva holds that there is no tfisas kedushin on a chayve lav, somebody that's forbidden to you via a lav, over a lav if you marry her. If you go and give her kedushin, it does not take any effect. There's no kedushin at all. That's why in the case where the Yavam gave chalitza to the Yevama, now she's chalutzaso, he can't marry her. Now that would be a lav. And according to Rabbi Akiva, there's no tefisas kedushin there. Therefore, if he does mimer after that, that's a regular kedushin after chalitza. The word mimer doesn't really apply there. He gave her kedushin after he did chalitza. The zika is already off, so the mimer is nothing. So he gave her kedushin after he did chalitza. So that's really kedushin to a chalutza. So Rabbi Akiva holds it's a chayve lav. There's no tefisas kedushin on a chayve lav, and it doesn't work. However, the chachamim hold that there is tefisas kedushin on a chayve lav. Would hold that does work, and you do therefore require a get to that chalitza. So Gemara says, how could you say that this is going to be Kiva's opinion? We just saw a previous case in this Mishnah, which had to be going in the Rabbanan's opinion. What's that case? That case is that if he gives a get and then he does a mimer. So what happens then? So we said he still requires a chalitza because nothing broke the zika, and he also requires a get to undo that mimer. Why should that mimer have any effect? If we're going to Rabbi Akiva's opinion, once he gave a get, so that get is a divorce. He should be considered to be a grushaso, tzachayve lav, and that mimer should have zero effect. You shouldn't have to give another get to get rid of that mimer connection. So obviously it can't be Rabbi Akiva's opinion. So Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Well, first, Gemara introduces a brisa where Rabbi Akiva holds that way. He holds that a get given to a Yevama makes into a chayve lav. The brisa says that Rabbi Akiva quotes a pasuk that says that velo yuchal bail harishon asher sholcha. The extra phrase Asher Shalcha, the original husband that sent her away, he can't remarry her. Asher Shalcha is an extra phrase that's meant to include a Yavam and a Yevama, that he sent her away even from just Yibam, from just Zika, that creates an Isser between them, that they are still considered to be a Chayve Lav. So you see that Rabbi Akiva holds it as a Chayve Lav. It shouldn't be able to send her. He should not have any connection created by the Maimer afterwards. So the Gemara says, no, this is not a real chayve lav. There is no actual isra created by a get given to a Yevama. This pasuk here is just an asmachta, just meant to be a hint and a support, but it's not an actual lav d'oraisa that he was not allowed to do kiddushin to her. So there's no real lav there, and therefore Rabbi Akiva would say that this is not a real lav. And even according to Rabbi Akiva, there is tefisas kiddushin there, and you would require a get to break that mimer. Now, therefore, we're going to go with our previous statement that this brisa is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and that's why if he does maimer after chalitza, it's nothing. And the Gemara quotes a brisa that seems to support this. The brisa, Rabbi says that this halacha was only said according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that said that a chalutza counts as an erva, and therefore nothing works after a chalitza. But the chachamim disagree, and they would say that if you do a maimer after a chalitza, it does count, and you do require something to break that maimer. Now, Rabbi then continues, and he says, I hold that it depends what type of mimer he gives. If he says, I'm doing regular kiddushin, so then that works, because this is not a mimer, this is a kiddushin, and therefore it should work, even specifically according to Rabbi Akiva, it should work. However, if he says, I'm doing a yibum, I'm doing a mimer, then it doesn't work, because that's useless. There is no mimer anymore. The concept of mimer doesn't exist after chalitza was performed. Mimer is only something you can do when there's a zika. Now we have a brisa that expands on this statement of Rebbe a bit more, and it talks about somebody who does kiddushin after chalitza. The machlok is Rebbe and the chachamim. So everybody agrees, Rebbe and the chachamim agree, that if he did this kiddushin l'shem ishus, he said he's just marrying her, so there is tefisas kiddushin there, even though she's a chalitza. We're going the opinion of the chachamim here. There is tefisas kiddushin. She requires a get. If he does kiddushin in a manner of mimer, he says, I'm doing mimer to you, I'm doing kiddushin to my zika. So then this brisa says it's a machlokes between Rebbe and the chachamim. What halacha over there? Rebbe says that Rebbe says that does not require a get. It doesn't do anything because no zika exists, and therefore a mimer when on a non-existent kedushin it doesn't exist. The Chachamim say no, that does exist. That counts. That creates a kedushin anyway. Says Rav Yosef, what's Rebbe's reasoning? Because he's trying to do something that can't be done. He's trying to do a mimer, but a mimer can't happen when there's no zika. So we find a similar halacha. If somebody has a neighboring field to his field, and that field belongs to a ger, and the ger died, and he has no inheritors, and the first one to come and work the field is koneh the field. All he has to do is a chazaka on the field, it becomes his field. But somebody went and so this guy who had a neighboring field went and he worked the field because he thought it was his field. He wasn't doing it in order to claim the field, he was trying to just work his own field. So the halacha there is that it doesn't count. He didn't do anything because he didn't make a chazak on the field. He thought he was working his field. He didn't think he was doing anything. Here also, the guy thought he's doing mimer and he's not doing anything. He can't do a mimer because mimer doesn't work when there's no zika. So the Gemara says Abaye rejects the comparison. Abaye says in this case he's trying to make a kinyan. He's at least trying to marry the woman. He thought it works through mimer. Fine, it doesn't work through mimer. It works through kiddushin because there's no zika anymore. Great, but why is that useless? It's not like the case of the ger. The case of the ger, he wasn't trying to do any kinyan at all. He thought he was working his own field. You know what it's comparable to? Says Abaye, it's comparable to if he thought he was working one ger's field and he was working somebody else's field. So he's trying to make the wrong kinyan, but he's still trying to make a kinyan. And therefore, there's not a good comparison, and he rejects this understanding of why Rebbe says the mimer doesn't work here. Says Abaye, therefore, what actually is the machlokes between Rebbe and the Chachamim is slightly different. It's the guy comes and he says, "Be mekadesh me with the mimer of Yevamim." That means he says that I want to use my zika to create this kedushin. So Rebbe says the mimer builds on a zika. That's how it works. It only works together with a zika. And here there is no zika, so it doesn't work. The Chachamim hold, no, a mimer is an independent thing and it works on its own, and therefore it could work. Now, even this Rava is not happy with. Rava says, no, if you just said Maimer Yibmin, that wouldn't work according to everybody. That would work according to everyone. Everyone would agree that the Maimer is fine. Here, it's talking about where he says, Be Makadesh to me with the Zikas Yibmin. That's what there is a machlokes over here. And actually, the machlokes between Rebbe and the Chachamim is, do we say Yesh Zika or Ein Zika? That's an irregular case where Chalitza was not done. And we say that the mimer works, is that because you hold yesh zika, there's a strong zika which creates a connection, and the mimer just kind of caps it off. And therefore, in this case, where there's no zika, because the chalitza was already performed, it can't work. Or is it ein zika? Really, the zika is nothing, the mimer itself works on its own, and therefore, in this case, it could work even without any zika.